Hi everyone, I'm Cody Root. This is the Church of Logic, and today I'm going to talk about P versus NP. This is a tiny bit out of the scope of the usual subdivision of this podcast because it's sort of adjacent to logic. It's more in the computer science realm than it is in the logic realm, but that's okay because it's a really cool problem, and I think everybody interested in logic, math, philosophy, or anything really, deserves to know a little bit about this problem. I personally think this is the most important open problem in all of mathematics. And I think you should sort of hear about it. It's exciting. It's interesting. The person who first posed this problem was, again, Gödel, who basically, I think he had his hands in everything interesting that mathematics had to say about metamathematics in the 20th century. I mean, he's just an incredible person. He wrote this letter in 1956, I think. 52, my notes say. So he wrote this letter. This genius logician, Kurt Gödel, wrote a letter to this genius logician John von Neumann, two really pillars of mathematics of the 20th century. And he said, okay, this incompleteness phenomenon where maybe there are theorems that can be proven in a given formal system. I'm not sure it really matters that much because let's say there's a way to, say, take an input number, say, 10 million, and ask, okay, well, is there a proof of this statement that takes less than 10 million pages? And he says, well, note this is actually decidable, right? I could just write down all possible proofs that are 10 million pages long and see if those are proofs of the thing that I care about. Say, I don't know, the Riemann hypothesis or the Collatz conjecture, right? The 3n plus 1 problem. So I write down all these proofs that are 10,000 pages long, and none of them are proofs of the thing I care about. Well, then I'm kind of done, right? Like, what else is there to do? Maybe it's undecidable, maybe it's not, but I've written down all the proofs of lengths I care about, right? If there's a proof that's longer than that, I know that there's no shorter proof, and at some point, it doesn't really matter, right? I've tried everything I could, and it doesn't really matter anymore if this statement is decidable or undecidable, because for all effective purposes, it's undecidable. And then he wrote, okay, sure, I could do that, but every proof of length, 10,000 pages, that's tons and tons of pages, right? Of tries. You have to try this astronomically large number, right? 10,000 pages is a lot, but it's something we can comprehend, right? It's, I have more pages on my bookshelf, but trying down every possible proof of that length, that's infeasible, like inhumanly feasible. And so Gödel says, okay, well, but it's not clear that you actually have to try all those possible proofs. Maybe there's a way, a technique to short circuit that, where we can sort of say, okay, well, I know this approach won't work. I know that approach won't work. I don't actually have to list out all the tries that are that long. And then he said, okay, well, that's probably not the case. I probably have to do quite a bit of work. But I couldn't prove that I have to do all that work. Maybe there's a shortcut, but I just can't prove that there's no shortcut. I tried, but I couldn't. Great. So this is the fundamental insight. Unfortunately, we don't know, I think, what von Neumann replied to that, or if he even received the letter at all. But the problem, stayed there where it was. And in the early 70s, Cook and Levin, I forget their first name. I think John Cook and I forget Levin's first name. They rediscovered essentially this problem, and I'm going to explain what the problem is and why it's so fascinating. So the problem is this: you have a machine, and that machine is allowed to make guesses. This is called a non-deterministic Turing machine, right? Basically, you could say, hey, this machine takes an input and it needs to compute something with that output. Say, is this a proof of a theorem, or, is this other machine going to return 1, or something like that. Solve a problem. Does this graph contain a cycle? So these are problems, and you have Turing machines to solve this. But you could say, okay, well, just guess one, and if you have it right, just check that it's the right one. And you could also say, okay, well, the list of guesses is written on some piece of the input, right? Say you have a number of bits of zeros and ones, and those determine your guesses. So what Cook and Levin noticed, and Gödel had also implicitly noticed, is that usually it's really, really easy to verify things. Really, you can take in a guess and check if the guess is correct, right? Say a graph has a cycle, right? That's something really easy to guess, to verify if a guess is right. You just look at the cycle and see if, oh yeah, it's actually a cycle in this graph. Or say you're guessing whether or not a theorem has a proof, right? The guess is the proof. You just look at the proof and see if it's actually a proof. In particular, we talked about satisfiability quite a bit, and we talked about this notion of guesses. And in satisfiability, you have a proposition that's just, A or not A, or some standard combination of, Boolean combination of variables. And the question is there some assignment of true and false to these variables so that when I evaluate this combination, I get true? Okay, and it's very easy to guess, right? You just say, oh, A is true, B is false, or something, and then you can check very easily. You just evaluate the Boolean expression, you see if it reduces to true, and great. So a non-deterministic Turing machine is a machine that makes these guesses and succeeds if and only if any of the guesses, any possible guess, would return true, right? So it's allowed to basically magically find the guess. And then we say that it's polynomial time, a non-deterministic polynomial time machine, if for the problem in question, if it takes an input, say the SAT formula or the graph or whatever the input is to the problem, then it'll take that guess, run in time polynomial to the size of the input, right? So if the input is like 10th, maybe it'll take time 10 squared or 10 cubed or something. And it'll find the solution to that problem using the guess. And it doesn't need to figure out the guess. The guess is just an input, and it's a good guess, right? It's a perfect guess. So the question we ask here, the open question is there a way to do as good without the guess? You take an arbitrary Turing machine that solves a problem using a very clever guess in time polynomial in the input. Is there another machine, a different machine, that doesn't need the guess and that can solve the same problem in time polynomial to the input? Now, the obvious answer is no, right? Because, you don't have the guess, right? So how could you possibly figure out what that guess is? But, one thing to note is that you don't actually necessarily need the guess, right? For finding a cycle in a graph, it's very easy, if I tell you, oh, this is the cycle in the graph, to go and check and say, oh yeah, actually, this is a correct cycle, therefore the graph has a cycle. But the general problem of finding a cycle in a graph, that you can solve in polynomial time, right? You have to walk through the graph and figure out if there's a cycle. And you sort of remember what nodes reach the other nodes. And if you find that a node can reach itself, hey, you found a cycle. You can really do that in polynomial time. But there are other problems where it's much more subtle, and it's very much not obvious whether you can figure these things out in polynomial time. The example we gave a couple of episodes ago was satisfiability, right? This Boolean satisfiability problem, it's really hard to know if you can figure out if there's going to be an input that returns true in polynomial time. Because essentially here the guess is the assignment to the variables, and it's very hard to imagine what way you could have to avoid making any guesses, right? If you have A or Here you could set A to true, and that whole thing is true. But you had to guess, right? We could have guessed A is false. Now, in my example, it doesn't really matter what A is. And one thing that's subtle about this problem is that it's very much not obvious one way or the other. I think you have this intuitive feeling that there's no way to magically avoid guessing inputs when you solve a SAT problem. But also there's no way to prove that you can't, right? It's a very hard impossibility proof. Proving that you can't do something is always a little bit more subtle because you have to consider all possible ways, even ways that you haven't imagined yet. This problem has been open since it was proposed in the 70s. People have worked on it very, very hard, and people think it's connected to these very deep problems involving guessing versus verifying. It's one of the Clay mathematics problems, which have a $1 million prize. It's very rare, actually, for math problems to have monetary prize associated to them. This is, one of the most famous ones. And let's see, next time I'm going to try and explain a little bit more what makes this problem so tantalizing and the extent of our ignorance of this whole landscape. I'm also going to try and give you a little bit of intuition on what things we do know, what things we don't know, and how this problem is different from the classic halting problem, which I explained also a couple episodes back. Until then, take care.